Hello. So this video is part of my Chinese philosophy series. It's been a little while since I've posted a video in this. I'm really excited today because we're going to talk about genre networks and empire, rhetoric in early imperial China by Xiaoye You. And I'm joined by Dr. Yo. So first off, Xiaoye, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Xiaoye You is a liberal arts professor of English and Asian studies at the Pennsylvania State University. He's published extensively in comparative rhetoric, multilingual writing, and world Englishes. His first monograph, Writing in the Devil's Tongue, A History of English Composition in China, won the 2011 4C's Outstanding Book Award. His recent book, Cosmopolitan English and Transliteracy, Arguing for Ethical Use of English in Everyday Life and for Cultivating Global Citizens in English Literacy Education, received the 2018 4C's Research Impact Award. Also, a more personal connection, Xiaoye trained me last fall to teach the Writing in the Social Sciences class here at Penn State. So I know firsthand how smart and insightful he is. So
Thank you.
Let's jump into talking about genre networks and empire. So first off, Xiaoye, can you just give us sort of a brief overview of the argument that this book is making?
Great. Well, thank you very much for this question. I wrote this book primarily for audiences in rhetoric studies, but at the same time, I was aware there was some interest, in history, Chinese history, scholars over there. But primarily speaking to scholars in rhetoric studies, the argument is this: because of the neoliberal, world order, that has been in place or celebrated by the U.S. and the West, right? So rhetoric studies in the U.S. Has largely focused on the Greek-Roman tradition. And of course, it's focused on Western rhetoric primarily. And when it comes to the study of non-Western rhetoric, or what sometimes people say global rhetorics, rhetoricians continue to use the Greek-Roman concepts, to look at the non-Western rhetoric theories and practices. And so use those not only as perspectives and also like a god, to evaluate, to say, the Chinese, they do in this way, because they lack this democratic tradition, and so on. And so for that reason, when Chinese rhetoric, ancient Chinese rhetoric, was studied in the U.S., the scholars tend to express a lot of interest in the rhetoric theories and practices developed in the Warring States period. Because the Warring States period, in a sense, it looks a little bit like a democracy or like the traditional Western European society, in the sense of like nation states that were fighting against each other, and so rhetoric played a very important role, in diplomacy, in various domains of public deliberation, and so on. And there has been very little scholarship, moving beyond the Warring States period, into this imperial period where, or when China became a kind of unified, centralized, state. So why it's the case? It's because of the so-called democratic world order that has been very much celebrated in the U.S. mainstream media, society, and the influence in the academic field. And so in my book, I argue that, for us to understand ancient Chinese rhetoric, we really have to move beyond the Warring States period into the early imperial stage or period to have a better grasp of Chinese rhetoric. And so in my book, I try to demonstrate that in the early imperial China, public deliberation, public debates, continue to flourish in what people will call this kind of autocratic authoritarian society. And very importantly, rhetoric, public deliberation debates took place not only through oral means, but also through written channels as well. And starting in the Warring States period and moving into the early Imperial periods. Early Imperial, what I meant is from 221 BC to 220 CE, and so in that period, written genres really very flourished and very well established, and sponsored by governments and very widely used in governmental communications. So public deliberation and argumentation unfolded, in these both oral and written means, oral and written genres. And to understand Chinese rhetoric in the early Imperial period, we can really direct our attention to these genre networks, because only through the networks that the government were able to carry out their communications, and the deliberations were able to carry out over this vast piece of land. Imagine, half of the U.S. anything east to Indianapolis, right? So that was very much where the Han Dynasty was like at that time. To engage that kind of public deliberation across the vast land. That's all. That's what you need to do, through the networks of the different texts and the body, human body. So there's a materiality involved in that. But anyway, so my central argument, was simply let's look beyond the Warring State period to look at the Imperial period, and also not only look at oral communication, but also written communication. And that's where public deliberation took place. So that's my central argument of the book.
Okay,
Thanks.
Great. Yeah. So you had already given these dates. That was actually one of the things I was going to point out. One thing we get, I hate this light because of the way you can't see anything. One thing we get in the book is this really useful timeline very early on of the sort of early history, or early dynasties of China, the pre-imperial period into the Warring States period, and then the imperial period of the Qin and Han dynasties. And then throughout the book, you give us a lot of information about the history of the Warring States period, and even more so of the imperial period. Bearing in mind that you're not primarily a historian, can you sort of contextualize the early imperial period for us a little bit more? Like what's going on politically, what's going on culturally, maybe artistically, whatever it is in the Qin and Han dynasties?
Well, thank you for this question. To contextualize my study, for the reader, that's what I try to do. And sometimes, we struggle with what extent you need to provide the detail, right? And so when I wrote the book, I assumed the readers probably don't know much about the Chinese history, but they have certain interests. So I have readers like you in mind. All right, so more directly to your question, Qing and Han period. Before the Qing and Han period, for several hundreds of years, or even maybe longer, China had a lot of city-states, as they are called, in the West, city-states, and so they had their sovereignty, certain autonomy, but at the same time, there was a kind of there's a kind of like a federal government out there. But as time went on, the federal government really lost most of its power and its control over these city-states. So these city-states were really on their own, and that's there were several hundreds of those city-states to start with, and then gradually through wars annexation through marriage relations and so on. And the number started to shrink. In Confucius' time, there were several dozen. And then after Confucius died, the historic records he kept, the historic records he kept were called the annals of spring and autumn, or spring and autumn annals. So after he died, then his period ended. The period of spring and autumn period ended, and then historians call the next stage is the Warring States period. That doesn't mean anything before the Warring States. There were no wars, but it's more of the nature of record keeping, because Confucius kept the spring and the autumn annals. That's why anything before that is called that name. I'm looking at the dynastic tables that I have here. So after he died, is the Warring States period. And so there have been a lot of records about the Warring States period. And we know during that period, there were a couple of, let's see, there was a few dozen or states, but very soon, within a few years, the number of states really dropped to only 7, and then 6, and then in the end, the state of Qin, through wars and intrigues, it conquered the other 6 or 7, other 6 states, and then so the ruler of Qin was able to kind of unify all these states, to make one large state, and that's the beginning of the Qin dynasty. But that dynasty did not last very long. It only lasted about 15 years, and then the Han dynasty was established. And again, there were a lot of wars, and in the end, the Han dynasty was established. And the Han dynasty was, again, very much like the Qin dynasty. It has this unified state with a big piece of land. So that's what happened, or why we call them with this name, starting with the spring and autumn period and Warring States period, and then move into the Imperial period. Then we had Qin dynasty for about 15 years, and the Han dynasty for about 400 years. Politically, because that's a unified state, and so the ruler called themselves emperors. And well, of course, that's English translation. In Chinese, it's a Huangdi, but it's equivalent emperors in a sense as being the only ruler of this large piece of land. Because of the concentration of power, so these are all very the rule. The government is very autocratic. There's a central government, right, and all the local government, the governors need to report to this ruler. Culturally, in the Warring States period, because of the existence of multiple city-states and the dispersal of power, among these states, so the rulers were able to attract intellectuals to their systems, to become their entourage, and thus that encouraged the flourishing of different schools of thought, because they really fight against each other in a sense, for a sponsorship, for patronage, and so on. So now we heard about different schools of thoughts like Confucianism, legalism, the Daoism, and other schools of thoughts as well. And so when there was when China started to have this kind of more centralized power system, there was less competition needed for these different schools of thoughts. And so the central government really drew these various schools together, or the intellectuals together, but they still need to run the think tank, right? So as a way to draw the intellectuals together, they started doing like exams, which evolved into like civil service exams in the end, right? So they started those exams. They through those exams they more explicitly championed Confucianism in general, because Confucianism comes the closest to this federal government political structure. Because Confucianism really champions this hierarchy. Everyone needs to recognize your place in the society. As a husband, to perform your role as a wife, right? And then if you're official, be loyal to the ruler. The ruler, you have to take care of the people, and so on, right? So the emperors find political and the spiritual religious support from Confucian thinking. So they sponsor Confucianism, and because of that sponsorship, right, other schools of thoughts, if you study other schools of thoughts, you can continue to do that. But if you want to be involved in the political power, for example, if you want to become part of it, then you have to really become familiar with Confucianism, and then to really join the conversation with them, be able to be recruited to become a civil servant, and so on. So that was a huge change. But that change does not mean public deliberation and debates will evaporate, because government decisions are still made based on deliberations within either open door or closed door contexts. Let me just end my answer here. It's a kind of elaborate answer, but I want to highlight that kind of a transition, moving from a relatively chaotic city-state-based political structure to a more centralized structure. And that gave rise to the government sponsorship of Confucianism, with other schools of thoughts being gradually absorbed and into this think tank structure, through government recruitment.
Okay. So the other thing that is really central to the book that you talk about as a transition from the sort of early or the pre-imperial period and the warring states period is the consolidation of specific genre networks. So in the book, you give us this definition of genre network. It says a genre network is defined as an array of connections and meanings that unfold as a discourse or a series of discourses is produced and circulated in response to a socio-political exigency. So I think that's a pretty good definition, but can you, for my audience of largely non-rhetoric scholars, can you talk a little bit more about what genre networks are and why they're important? Either for early imperial China specifically, or for sort of rhetoric studies more broadly.
Right. I would say genre networks, this concept is not brand new. In studies of technical communication, they were already studies done, trying to understand, for example, how communication takes place in enterprise, in a company, or like in an institution like the university, for example. We write emails, which became which to start a conversation on a particular issue, and the emails were sent to someone or several individuals to start a conversation. Then they would decide to meet, right? So the email really mobilized the human bodies, and as well as technology. Like now we are using laptops or computers for Zoom meetings and so on.
Yeah.
And after those meetings, we will come to a certain decision. It will become a memo, memo that saved, really as part of the archive. And sometimes the issue we discuss is so serious that it will not just become a memo. It will become a policy. A policy document. And then that will become something like a policy published, say, let's say, in the graduate school website, right? So here we see this involvement, which starts with just an email. I would say it's a pretty common bureaucratic genre, right? And that mobilizes human bodies that would decide to meet at a certain date, and that deliberation involve oral discourse conversations. And then one of the participants will come up, will sum up the conversation with a memo, and then and sometimes the memo can with some editing can become a policy document to be posted on somewhere, become the policy for the entire institution. So here we see the multiple genres are mobilized. Written genre and oral genre, and the process involves not only text but also human bodies, objects, and the network spread out across space and also time, and so on. So that's a real life example of how genre networks forms and operates and shapes important decisions. And so here, right, and this perspective has been largely used in study institutional discourse, primarily these days, and in especially in technical communication. But why it matters to study rhetoric in my context? The reason is, as I explained, in the early Imperial period, if you want to understand rhetoric, if you just want to focus on written conversation, written discourse, like staged public debates and so on, as it often happened, in ancient Greece and Rome, that's inadequate. There were public debates and discourse as well that taking place in the court. Fine. Right, but that's inadequate because we're talking about the ruling of an empire with this vast piece of land, and communication and the public deliberation. Really, oftentimes it went out, in this way, and then coming back. It's doing this rather than everyone is jumping, talking, debating in one place. No, it goes everywhere and then coming back and then goes everywhere again. So genre network, I thought, is the best way to capture that kind of activity, and also break out from this narrow understanding of rhetoric as involving ethos, pathos, logos. It's all happening here. No, that's not accurate, right? So it's really happening in this kind of spread out, very situated, but also distributed way. And I think to best capture rhetoric as public deliberation or debates, discussion in the Han Dynasty, the genre network is a better framework to understand the interactions and so on. That's why I went for that concept.
Okay, great. So in the book, you talk about a lot of different types of documents created, and you talk about a lot of different contexts for public deliberations, trying to determine what various natural phenomena mean about how society is being run, the role of women, the nature of the art, things like this. This is a bit more of a personal opinion question, but is there a particular genre network or a style of early imperial writing that you find most interesting?
I mean, in any of those contexts you mentioned, I mean, there were just all, I mean, a lot of interesting examples of visual networks. Let me try
Yeah,
one or two. I mean, if we have time, because you mentioned like there were instances when there was a natural phenomenon, right? Like for example, there's a terrible earthquake, which happened a few months ago in Turkey, right?
yeah,
I mean, unfortunately, so many people were killed. Um, and sometimes after earthquake, there could be another, earthquake that came after, and there's a famine. And sometimes, there could be comets, going through in the sky a lot, right? And so in ancient times, right, people try to make sense of those natural occurrences, and the astrology, the astrologists, will keep records of things happening, in the sky, as well as some
yeah,
like natural events, um, major events happening, because these are, I mean, for ancient Chinese, these all carry certain socio political and religious meanings. They're not just natural events. You can study it from a scientific perspective, right? But in ancient China, they carry those meanings. So for example, um, when the, let's say, Mars, right, it always stays here, but today why suddenly came very close to the moon, to this half moon, right? Why it happened, right? So astrologers, they will take notes. So they will write a memo, right? They will send to the memorial, submit the memorial, to the emperor, and not only recording it, also offering a kind of interpretation,
yeah,
based on historical precedents, based on certain frames or certain ways of interpretation that they inherited from the past, right? So a memorial, and so the memorial is one of the genres standardized by the government, right?
yeah,
Once it's presented to the emperor will certainly respond, right? And oftentimes in the past is this: the emperor will respond by writing a edict, an edict. So in the edict he will say, well, this happened, right, and that also happened, and this happened again. This really make me ponder about my government.
yeah,
This must be the case that I didn't do very well, okay, in certain areas. So what are the areas I could done better? I could have done better, right? Now please, all officials reading this edict, tell me why or what happened, what I haven't done well that caused this heavenly anger or wrath, that I was sent these messages. So these natural occurrences are messages of God or heaven, right?
yeah,
So he will issue this edict. So that's a different genre, So it's out, right? Once the edict is out, then, well, at the same time in the edict he will say, please help me, advise me, right? And then so the edict will go out. Again, it's not just a document. It starts to mobilize people, officials, right? It will be usually sent out through messengers who rode horses, for example. And
yeah,
so it traveled for 10 days or half a month. It really traveled to all corners of the empire, not only just within the central government, right? And so in 3 months, for example, governors of different prefectures, like states, were sent 2 or 3 well-known scholars to the central government, to the capital city, to answer the emperor's questions. And so what they do is to meet in the court, and the emperor will ask some specific questions, and these individuals will sit down and like take an exam, writing up their answers to the emperor's concerns, and present it to the emperor, right? And so that's like the exam essays, right? So that's another genre. So here we see this very interesting phenomenon, right? Or natural phenomena happen, and then the calendar officers or the astrologers, they would take notes and offer the interpretation and write it in a genre, submit it to emperor, and the emperor will respond with an edict which called for responses or interpretations of his officials, right? And the officials send in, instead of they respond, they send in what they think as the experts or scholars to come into the court to offer their confidential reading of or suggestions of government and so on. So here we see, the mobilization of multiple genres, or the genre again will mobilize individuals and so make them come together to deliberate a particular political issue. Well, I hope that's a helpful example.
Yeah.
And that's in the domain of metaphysics. I mean, this is a domain, as a metaphysical, religious, and political domain, right? And in my book, I talk about religious domain. Sorry, I talk about the military domain. I talk about the cultural aesthetic domain as well. How these various genres were used, to mobilize people and their thoughts on a particular issue, and to help establish these various hierarchies, religious hierarchy, gender hierarchy, ethnic, military, political hierarchy, aesthetical and the linguistic hierarchy. How various genres were mobilized to establish these various hierarchies, and ultimately to establish the imperial matrix of power for the empire. And so that's that's how things fit together to make the argument that the genre networks were instrumental in establishing the imperial matrix of power.
Yeah. So I really like that idea of, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There is this big difference between like the ecclesia or the assembly in ancient Athens, where you get as many citizens as you can cram in that space, and then people talk at them to try and convince them, versus this much more mobile type of approach to discourse that you have in the imperial system. And there's this one image you give in this book that was excavated near Juan, Juyan. I don't know if that's right or not.
Right. Juyan. Juyan. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Juyan.
This image right here, I think this is a really actually kind of brilliant depiction of what you're describing, because basically these like local officials have put together this recommendation for what should be done over the coming holidays. Like they send it up the chain of command, and each person sort of slightly transitions it from like, here's what these local officials think should be done, to here's the official recommendation. And then you get this great bar like right here in the middle. I think this is my favorite bit, because it goes to the imperial court and the emperor is just like, granted, and then it goes back down, and it sort of moves, it changes from a recommendation by local officials to a sort of formal request by higher ranking regional officials. Then it gets imperial approval, and then it transitions to, now this is an order for what should be done. it's almost like an analog version of an email chain where you can just read back through what everybody has written. I think it's really interesting the way that within this very efficient and organized bureaucracy, information moves in a way that it doesn't move in the Greco-Roman context. So
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure about your last comment, saying like the information does not move as much or
well,
move in the
so
same
it
way in the
doesn't.
Greek-Roman system. Probably it does in that way too, but just the record has not been very well kept, so we don't get to
Yeah,
see this so vividly. Maybe um, uh, that's what based
I
on
guess
what I read.
so. I guess from my understanding of rhetoric in the Greco-Roman context, like when announcements go out or things like that, when information is made public, it's not really dialogue as much anymore. Like there's localized dialogue, but then like in Athens, for instance, when a new law is passed, they carve it on a pillar, and that
Right.
pillar is publicly displayed.
Yes.
So you don't have that sort of. We can now have conversation about it. It is here is the information. Whereas with this system, like again, the emperor sends out an edict, says, "What does this eclipse or this flood or this earthquake or whatever it is mean? Come, send your scholars to tell me what it means." And then there's sort of dialogue, presumably that happens in person, but also dialogue that happens through the interaction of these documents. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. I guess this has something. I mean, we are able to gain access to that kind of dialogues. For several reasons. Number one, Chinese court historians keep good records, of those documents, and they have access to those documents. And when they write history, they try not only to tell history in their own voice, but also they try to incorporate as much of the original communications as possible in the narration. Um, and also the record keeping in China has been very good historically,
Yeah.
And now with and even now we still make archaeological findings. Certainly when you open up a tomb or a particular site like old well, right? The entire well is filled with those wooden or bamboo strips, documents, government documents. Because once they gather so much documents, what do? They dump it into empty well or abandoned well, right? So it will be secured. And so I guess these are the reasons that now we gain access to the details of ancient ways of communication. Um, yeah. Well, thank you for this observation and for adding this Greek-Roman perspective to that conversation. Thank you.
So the last thing I wanted us to talk about in this interview, kind of shifting from early imperial Chinese philosophy or rhetoric to contemporary Chinese philosophy or rhetoric. One of the things you talk extensively about in Genre Networks and Empire is the decolonial project that guides the work in the book. Can you sort of tell us about what decolonialism is, why it matters, and how you approach it in the book?
Right. Yeah, that is I mean, part of the framework I was using to develop the agency or the exigency of the study, why this study is necessary. I explained a little bit in answering the first question about the argument of this paper. So what is decolonial scholarship, or what is the focus? What is a major conversation? The general conversation so far is this: the modernists or the imperial, these are kind of imperial modernist or colonial matrix of power, continue to operate in our life, through various structural modes, and including scholarship, including knowledge making in academia, of course, in political economic structures as well. But here in the academic context, this imperial or colonial or modernist matrix of power continues to operate. And so for academics, it's important to expose and critique this matrix of power. And at the same time, we can look elsewhere, to identify other ways of knowledge making. So at the same time also to de-link, to move away from the modernist or colonialist ways of knowledge making, look elsewhere to embrace other ways of knowledge making. In the end, we probably will not end up completely de-link, but at least we will be able to work in this what people call a third space or contact zone when it comes to knowledge making. So we will not be completely dominated by modernist or colonial ways of knowledge. So in that way, we hopefully do more justice to the world. So that's the general idea for decolonization. How to where we still live in the what people call coloniality. We still live in the aftermath of colonialism, and so we have to recognize the negative or the injustice that caused by colonialism. Especially in the academic field, that's knowledge making, and then do something about it. And so delinking and retrieving other ways of knowledge making is one of the decolonial options. There are different ways to decolonize, and this is one of the options that we can do, especially in the academia. So decolonial very much means that, for me, when I use this term to frame my book, and so I see my book as one of those efforts to decolonize, to move away from modernist knowledge-making practice frameworks, to look elsewhere, find other frames and the references for us to make knowledge in rhetoric studies and in language studies, in your case, the study of drama. Excuse me. And so more specifically in my book, I think I made a few moves, to allow me to fully embrace the decolonial, or to make this decolonial move. I think I did two things. Number one is to study genre networks in early imperial China. I did not just use the framework that are already developed in the West in technical communication, right? What I did is to look into the Chinese literary scholarship, and I identified two key figures who developed the idea of genre networks. That is 文体经纬 in Chinese. 文体 means genre, 经纬 means, metaphorically, it means networks. No. So I retrieved this idea first from a scholar called Liu Xie. He wrote a book in year 5, exactly around 500 CE. The book is called The Literary Mind and the Calling of Dragons. And what he did in the book is to really analyze, to give a survey of all genres in Chinese writing, and then study each genre and talk about the characteristics of each genre and how to write, that particular genre in that particular genre. And what he was ultimately doing is to celebrate Confucian classics, and seeing other types of texts as playing this subservient role, to these texts, either as a way to elaborate, to illustrate, or to extend these classic texts. So that's his thesis, or one of the theses in the book, and that's his way of envisioning the relationship between these various texts, in this big network system. So his perspective is network, but it's a little bit more kind of static. Because he tried to map out each genre, into its right place, and so on. And then I move on to look into historical writing, and identify Sima Qian, who was very well known for his work. It's called The Records of the Grand Historian, so he composed one of the early Chinese dynastic histories. And when he was writing the history, he not only invented many more genres for history writing, but also when he was writing the entries for his book, for the chapters of his book, for example, he invented this relatively new genre in history writing, that is writing telling stories or constructing historic narratives based on biographies, identify key individuals historically, and writing his narratives based on these individuals' experiences, put them back into the historical context. And so along the way, he was able to insert these individuals' discourses. Many of them were oral discourses that were kind of passed all the way down because of the oral tradition, the narrative tradition in China. But also because he had access to the archives. He was a court he was a court historian, so he was able to insert the textual artifacts into their biography, right? And so he sees the discourses as a very important part of the historical action. These discourses, material-wise as well, they really worked as agents together with these historic figures in moving the wheels of history forward, or in a certain directions, right, to cause major historical or political achievements, and so on. So here he sees the genre as interacting with each other, in real historical context, as time, they unfold together with events, with individuals, and so on. So very much like the way I describe genre networks, the kind of examples, because that's exactly how he described, like Dong Zhongshu, who was one of those court officials who were invited, who were invited to answer the emperor's calls and questions in the court by taking an exam, by writing an exam essay, right? So, so that's the kind of genre network, that was described, recorded by Sima Qian. So I went into the genre network theories that were developed and mobilized in the writing by these two Chinese historic figures as a way to perform this kind of decolonial, look elsewhere, look for other ways of knowledge making, historically, rather than just Western modernist or colonialist ways of knowledge making, right? So that's the first move I made in terms of taking this decolonial approach. The second move is this, as I mentioned, the decolonial scholars, they argue that it's just so important for us to expose and critique the colonial and imperial matrix of power that continue to shape our life, at the moment, right? So with that conversation, I thought, well, the way of structure my book, probably is to identify these various hierarchies, established within the matrix of power, through the means of rhetoric, right? So that's why I structured my chapter based on these hierarchies. So that like the first chapter, like the second chapter, deals with how the religious and the metaphysical hierarchy was established, through genre networks. And the second chapter, I largely talk about how the gender hierarchy was established through games of deliberations and the debates and so on. And that did so for the other chapters as well. So the second point is the imperial matrix of power. So in my book, I really look into this kind of really, again, imperial matrix of power and how it was established. I mean, with the hope that more attention can be directed towards that matrix of power in rhetoric studies. So these are the two ways that I engaged and mobilized this decolonial scholarship to guide my own study, to allow me to have this conversation, to bring this study of early Chinese rhetoric to the ongoing conversations about decolonial efforts in rhetoric studies or in language studies in general. Well, thank you for this very great question, and yeah, that's what I did to engage the decolonial scholar.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it gives us a really interesting approach across the book to understand early imperial Chinese rhetoric kind of on its own terms, as opposed to either, again, seeing it as compare and contrast or exclusively compare and contrast with Greco-Roman traditions, or as this sort of idealized, oh, this was a, I don't know, this was a sort of simplified, unified narrative of what was going on, because it wasn't. I mean, it's human beings, and human beings are never simple and unified. We're always complex and contradictory, and yeah, I think that balance you strike between we're looking at Chinese rhetoric the way that second century BCE to second century CE Chinese rhetoricians looked at it, but we're also taking a critical eye and saying women's voices were largely erased, for instance. Like we can critique that at the same time as we say here is how that was approached and why it was approached in these ways. I think it's a really, really insightful book, really, really interesting. And yeah, I think it's broadening the conversation in rhetoric studies, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. All right, now let me turn the table around. Let me ask you a question. So now that you've read the book, so what did you find very interesting that you can make some comparisons with what you know about Greek and Roman drama as an art form, as a political art form, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I find most interesting, and again, part of it is there's so much, and you do talk about this in the book, there's so much of the rhetorical tradition, rhetorical history that we lose because it's done orally. But so much, because so much of the Chinese court and the bureaucracy is really devoted to like keeping records of things, writing things down to make sure that information is clear. And it is, again, these sort of conversational forms of writing where you write a thing and send it out, and then you get responses, and then you respond to those responses. Again, email, I think, is a really good comparison with so much of this. It is. I love that sort of dialogic approach, which there definitely is dialogue in Greco-Roman rhetoric, but again, it seems like a lot of it is more localized. And then once something like a law is passed, or a jury makes a decision, or a play is written, or something like this, um, that thing kind of stands on its own as a self-contained artifact to a certain extent. Whereas it seems like in the imperial Chinese context, it's less about the production of distinct artifacts and more about everything being part of a conversation, everything being open to growth, development, change based on what's sort of needed for to achieve a particular goal. So I think that's really, really interesting.
Well, maybe you gain that impression because of my focus on largely governmental communications.
Yeah,
But for certain texts, once they canonized, right,
yeah,
and
yeah,
they also become an object on its own terms, in a sense, like Confucian classics,
yeah,
right? They stand on their own. No, you can write hundreds of interpretations of it, but it stands on its own. With Rhapsody, which is a kind of a prose poetry, which became very popular in the Han Dynasty, especially in the second half of the Han Dynasty. Sometimes it's called the Eastern Han Dynasty. It
yeah,
was just so popular, uh, and oftentimes those things they are supposed to stand on their own because it's artistic work.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, but yeah, so I guess it all depends. Maybe because I focus on political discourse, public deliberation, and so on. So I so I gave you the impression that it was very dialogical,
yeah,
and it kind of it's also distributed. It's both situated but also distributed. Um, yeah, and that has something to do with this centralized government, system, which kind of sprawled out, into this big piece of land. Well, the Greek and Rome, especially the Greeks, it's a city-state
yeah,
based. So it was possible to gather all these stakeholders to have a meeting on a certain date, and then they make decisions at the end of the day, right?
yeah,
So they can stage those things for the political assembly or sporting events and so on. And the Chinese did so as well in the
yeah,
central government. Though they did that as well, but oftentimes the political deliberations sometimes just have to go very wide to gather opinions and responses for the central government, for the emperor to finally make a decision. It's just necessary. So that has something to do with the political structure, and also whether it's a city state or it's a larger sovereignty state. And so,
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean that's definitely a fair response. I mean the arts are definitely a bit of a different situation, and yeah, the political thing. I mean, I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is like if you compare Chinese political rhetoric at this time to say Roman rhetoric, like my sense of Roman rhetoric, and I'm not a specialist in Roman rhetoric, so I may be oversimplifying here, but like my sense is that major political decisions tend to be made within Rome itself, and then information distributed, right? With no, so it's a centralized system, but it's sort of command from the middle. Whereas, in a way, the system that you describe in the book for political rhetoric seems more almost like a sort of like tides, right? Like either a request goes out and then responses come in, or recommendations go in, approvals and orders go out. So there's this sort of backwards and forward motion. Whereas the way that I think of like Roman political rhetoric is more like dropping a pebble into a pond and the ripples just go out, but they don't necessarily come back in. Again, that's a very sort of simplified version of both what you talk about in the book and probably Roman rhetoric. But I think it's an interesting thing because the bureaucracy and the intelligentsia, the philosophers, the literati were so important to the functioning and the sort of self-definition of the imperial court and the way that things ran. And as we know about intelligentsia, literati, and philosophers, we love producing text. So I think it makes a lot of good sense there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, in the Chinese context, I would say the writing the development of the writing technology really played a big role.
Yeah.
In the early days, writing literacy level was so low. Only very few people were able to read and write. And at the same time, the expansion of writing technology, that people start to write on cloth, on silk, for rich people, for important documents. To them, manuscripts were written, and they were written on bamboo or wooden strips, and that manuscript culture, in general, people think that Chinese scholars believe that manuscript culture started come into being very prominently in the Warring States period. So that's why we get to see like so many, texts written from that period. So they all played a role in encouraging, giving rise to writing, and then the written genres. Because once you have writing in so many contexts, then you want to create like kind, right? I mean genre. The genre in French, and I'm studying French. Genre means like types, kinds. It's a very common everyday word in French. Well, in English, it's a more technical term. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the conversation. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah. All right, you have a great summer.